The sun hung low over the wide, dusty plains, casting long shadows across the river bend where the water ran dark and silent. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the faint metallic temps of iron from the rifles leaning against the weathered logs. Birds had stopped their songs, as if even they sensed the tension that gripped the land. Along the riverbank, a woman moved quietly, her steps light but careful, brushing against the tall grasses that whispered secrets in the evening breeze. She knew the dangers that lurked in the wild, but the quiet had lulled her into a fleeting sense of safety. Then, from the thicket near the bend, voices broke the silence. Rough, grating, and full of menace, the words carried an unmistakable threat. She froze, instinct sharpening her senses. 3 men had emerged, their shadows stretching toward her like dark fingers reaching from the underbrush. They circled her, boots sinking into the muddy bank, eyes cold and calculating. Each step they took seemed to echo, though the river's soft murmur should have swallowed their sound. The river, once her solace, now felt like a trap. The first man, tall and broad-shouldered, leaned forward, smirking with an unsettling confidence. His companion, wiry and quick, darted to the side, cutting off any chance of escape down the narrow path that led deeper into the forest. The third, a hulking figure with a crooked scar across his cheek, stepped behind her, cutting off the water's edge. She could feel the cold bite of fear creeping into her chest. But she kept her stance steady, her eyes flicking from one threatening face to another. Every instinct screamed to run, yet the men had her cornered. Time seemed to stretch as the sun dipped lower, staining the sky with streaks of blood red and gold. The wind carried the faint whisper of a distant horn, or maybe it was just her imagination, a desperate hope for a miracle. She clutched the strap of the satchel at her side, the only possession that held any real value, and waited, calculating, hoping, fearing. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears, a frantic drum that mirrored the tension in the clearing, and then he appeared, not from the forest, not from the shadows, but from the very air itself. It seemed silent and unannounced. A figure, tall and broad, moved with a grace that made the 3 men pause. The woman blinked, unsure if her eyes were deceiving her. The figure was unmistakably an Apache warrior, his presence commanding and calm, yet brimming with latent power. He emerged from the tree line, as if he had been part of the land all along, a ghost of the plains, his eyes sharp and unwavering. His hands rested lightly on the bow slung across his chest, and a quiver of arrows was strapped to his back. Even at a distance, the air seemed to shift. Heavy with a warning, the 3 men exchanged uneasy glances, the confidence draining from their faces. There was something about the warrior that unsettled them in ways they couldn't name. He stood between the woman and them, a silent sentinel who spoke without words, his gaze a blade sharper than any steel. The river's gentle flow seemed almost to pause around him, nature itself bending to his presence. The woman felt a strange surge of hope, though fear still held her tight. The tallest man took a step forward, raising a hand as if to assert dominance. "Step aside," he said, voice gruff, attempting to mask the unease that the warrior's calm radiated. "This doesn't concern you?" The warrior's eyes never wavered. One hand moved, subtle but deliberate, and an arrow was drawn from his quiver, its tip glinting in the dying sunlight. There was no threat in the motion, only readiness. A promise that if harm came, it would meet in equal force. The woman's breath caught in her throat. She had heard stories of the Apache, tales whispered in frontier towns and campfires about men who could appear from nowhere, men whose skill with bow and blade was unmatched, men whose presence alone could turn the tide of danger. She never thought she would see one, let alone now. Standing between her and the unknown menace that had trapped her, the wiry man made a sudden lunge, but the warrior's movement was a shadow, faster than the eye could follow. He raised his bow. A single arrow knocked and aimed with precision. The tension in the air was electric, a current that prickled the skin and tightened the chest. Each second stretched longer, every heartbeat louder. "You don't belong here." The warrior finally spoke, his voice low, carrying the weight of authority and quiet menace. The words were calm, yet they cut through the night sharper than the sharpest knife. The men hesitated. bravado draining from them as if the air itself had shifted against their favor. The woman wanted to speak, to thank him, to say something, anything, but words froze on her tongue. She only stared, her heart pounding, the danger still close enough that she could feel it pressing against her back. Her mind raced, wondering who these men were, why they had singled her out, and how a single warrior could make such a difference in a moment that had felt hopeless. Just breaths ago, the river murmured beside them, oblivious to the human tension playing out on its banks. Trees whispered in the wind, leaves rustling like cautious witnesses to the standoff. Even the sky seemed to hold its breath, fading from gold to a bruised purple as night crept closer. Shadows grew long, merging into the darkening forest, and the threat of the unknown seemed to multiply with every passing second. The scarred man took a step forward, his hand brushing the hilt of a knife, but the warrior's eyes met his with unwavering certainty. Not a word was needed. The message was clear: back down or face consequences far beyond their reckoning. The man's confidence faltered, and a flicker of fear crossed his face, quickly masked with a forced sneer. The woman's gaze darted between them, caught between relief and terror. She had come to the river seeking solitude, a moment of peace from the harshness of the frontier. Instead, she had stumbled into a peril that could have cost her life in a heartbeat. Yet now, standing before her, was a protector whose presence seemed as old and eternal as the land itself. She noticed small details: the way the warrior's eyes scanned the men, the slight tension in his stance, the deliberate calm in every movement. He was ready, but he did not rush. The air between them vibrated with unspoken understanding. One wrong move could shatter the fragile balance and turn the evening into chaos. The three men glanced at each other, uncertainty growing like a storm cloud overhead. Plans that had seemed simple moments ago now twisted into fear and doubt. The tall man swallowed hard, his hand dropping slightly from its threatening gesture. The wiry man's foot hovered, hesitant, unsure whether to advance or retreat. And the scarred man, ever the brute, clenched his jaw, realizing that brute force alone would not prevail against this silent sentinel. The woman's chest tightened as she realized the moment was suspended, caught between threat and salvation. She wanted to move, to flee, to step toward the safety that seemed to shimmer just beyond the warrior's presence. But fear pinned her to the spot. The river flowed quietly beside her, the only sound daring to breach the tense silence, and then the wind shifted. A low whistle threaded through the trees, carrying a warning or perhaps a challenge. The warrior's head tilted slightly, as if listening to some signal only he could perceive. The men stiffened, a chill creeping down their spines, though the source of their dread remained unseen. Something had changed. The balance had shifted, yet the outcome was uncertain. The woman felt a cold knot of anticipation tighten in her stomach. The danger was far from over. The men were still there, the warrior still poised, and the night closing around them brought with it the promise of more than a single confrontation. The moment held, electric and fragile, as if the entire world waited for what would come next. Her eyes met the warrior's briefly, and in that silent exchange, she understood the truth. He had arrived in time, but only barely. The threat had not passed, and the riverbank, once a place of solitude and peace, was now a stage for a perilous dance where the outcome was far from certain. And as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving shadows to stretch and mingle, the tension between life and danger, between fear and protection, settled over the clearing like a heavy fog. No one spoke again. Yet everyone knew the moment had reached a turning point. The woman's pulse raced, the men's confidence wavered, and the warrior remained a steadfast barrier between her and the unknown violence that had sought to reach her. The river's soft murmur continued, indifferent to human conflict, carrying the suspense into the night. The next move would decide everything, but for now, the world held its breath. The night thickened, folding the river bend into shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. The stars above were faint, barely piercing the dark veil of sky, and the air had grown cold with the weight of impending danger. The woman's gaze never left the warrior, though curiosity stirred alongside her fear. He was a figure carved from the land itself, strong, silent, and alert, but there was a history in his eyes, something that spoke of battles fought long before this moment. She felt an odd pull, sense that understanding him might also unlock the meaning behind the peril she had stumbled into. The men across from them shifted uneasily, their earlier confidence now replaced with a simmering uncertainty. The scarred man muttered something under his breath, a curse that barely carried over the soft rush of the river. The wiry one's eyes flicked to the forest, calculating escape routes, and the tallest man's jaw tightened, realizing that force alone would not win this evening. They lingered, as though testing the limits of the tension, unwilling to retreat, yet unwilling to act recklessly. The woman's mind wandered despite the fear, piecing together fragments of what she knew. She had grown up on the frontier, surrounded by stories of Apache warriors whose skill was unmatched, whose presence alone could turn the course of danger. Yet even the stories had never painted someone like him, a man who moved with the calm certainty of one in harmony with the earth. She could sense that this warrior carried more than just skill. There was a purpose, a reason he was here now. Something had drawn him, though she had no way of knowing what it was. A low rustle came from the underbrush, and the woman flinched. The warrior's head moved slightly, just enough for her to see the alertness in his stance. He did not speak, yet she felt his intention. He was reading every sound, every movement, anticipating threats unseen. Her pulse raced, a mixture of awe and apprehension. This was not a man merely defending her. He was guarding against forces she could not yet understand. The river ran slow and steady, reflecting the faint moonlight, a calm contrast to the uncertainty pressing in on the bank. It reminded her of simpler times, moments when life seemed predictable, yet those memories now felt distant and fragile. She had come here seeking solitude, a brief reprieve from the harshness of the frontier. Instead, she had stepped into a shadowed world where danger, skill, and fate intersected. The warrior shifted slightly, his movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. She noticed the faint scar along his forearm, worn like a badge of survival. Perhaps it marked battles long past, battles fought in silence, unseen by the world. His eyes, dark and intense, scanned the men with an unsettling precision, weighing threats, predicting reactions. She realized that each of these men had a story too, though she could not yet guess what had brought them here. The tallest man, with his rigid posture, exuded a history of authority and command, while the wiry one's twitching movements suggested a lifetime of evading consequences. The scarred man's stoic presence hinted at a past steeped in confrontation. The woman's fingers tightened around her satchel, a small talisman against the uncertainty surrounding her. It contained letters and papers, the remnants of a life she had built quietly, away from the chaos of the frontier towns. Somehow she felt that those documents, trivial as they might seem, were part of the reason the men had pursued her. Her imagination filled in the blanks. Perhaps they sought something she carried, or perhaps her mere presence disrupted plans she could not yet understand. Every scenario deepened the tension, feeding the knot of fear in her stomach. The warrior finally moved a step forward, breaking the fragile stalemate. The motion was smooth, almost effortless, but it carried an unmistakable weight. The men flinched in unison, instinctively sensing that the balance had shifted. He did not speak, but the implication was clear. He was ready to act, but only if forced. The air between the two sides crackled with anticipation, a silent countdown to a confrontation that could erupt at any second. The woman's mind drifted to her childhood, to the stories her grandfather had told her around the fire, tales of the land and its people, of skirmishes and uneasy alliances, of moments when courage and quick thinking had meant the difference between life and death. She wondered if the warrior had grown up with similar lessons, molded by the land and the trials it demanded. There was a sense of inevitability in his presence, as if he was the culmination of countless generations of survival and vigilance. The tallest man's eyes narrowed, and he stepped slightly to the side, attempting to read the warrior's intentions. But the warrior's expression remained unreadable, his calm like a stone set against the swirling tension of the moment. the woman realized that the standoff was no longer simply about her. Something larger was at play, a silent struggle whose rules she could not yet comprehend. The men were pawns in a game she barely understood, and the warrior was both protector and enforcer, a living embodiment of the frontier's hidden order. A hawk cried from high above, its wings slicing through the cold night air, and the sound seemed to resonate with the unease on the ground. The woman shivered, both from the chill and the growing sense of foreboding. The river's gentle murmur felt like a distant echo now, drowned out by the tension that filled the clearing. She noticed that the warrior's hands never left his weapons, yet there was no haste, no panic-only readiness and precision. The wiry man shifted again, glancing toward the forest's edge as if weighing escape. His eyes flicked to the woman briefly, a flash of calculation crossing his face. She could sense the desperation behind the bravado, a recognition that whatever force they faced was beyond ordinary reckoning. Even the scarred man, who had seemed immovable moments ago, now exhibited a subtle hesitation, his hand twitching near his belt as though uncertain whether to draw or retreat. Time seemed to stretch unnaturally, each second laden with unspoken possibilities. The woman's thoughts raced. Who were these men really? What had brought them here? And why had the warrior appeared at just the right moment? The answers remained elusive, tangled in shadows and half-heard whispers of danger. Yet she felt a thread of clarity amidst the chaos. Her survival now depended not only on courage but on understanding, on recognizing the currents of intention and power that flowed around her. The warrior's eyes flicked toward the woman briefly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. She felt a strange mixture of reassurance and unease. This man had chosen to intervene, yet she could sense that his presence carried obligations and histories far beyond her comprehension. Perhaps he had debts to settle, promises to honor, or enemies long forgotten. The frontier held many secrets, and the deeper they ran, the more perilous the path became. A gust of wind rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of smoke from distant fires, perhaps from a nearby settlement, or a warning of approaching trouble. The men shifted again, their plans faltering under the weight of the unknown. The woman could see the fear etched into their faces. Yet there was still a stubborn determination, a refusal to yield completely. It was the kind of tension that could erupt violently. And she sensed that the night had many more moments to reveal before safety could be claimed. The warrior stepped again, his movements deliberate, shaping the space around him. The woman noticed his boots pressing softly into the earth, as if the land itself responded to his presence. He was not merely standing guard. He was reading the terrain, anticipating reactions, weaving himself into the very fabric of the frontier. The men hesitated, caught in a web of uncertainty, while the woman felt the fragile thread of hope that had carried her this far. Yet even with hope, the danger remained. She could feel it pressing against her, coiling like a living thing, reminding her that the river, the trees, and the shadows held threats she could not yet see. The warrior's eyes never left the three men, his stance a barrier between life and peril. But the sense of unresolved tension hung over the clearing like a storm cloud on the horizon. The night was far from over, and every rustle, every shadow, could mark the beginning of a confrontation that might alter everything. She glanced at the river once more, its surface dark and reflective, and felt the weight of uncertainty settle over her shoulders. The warrior had arrived just in time, yet she understood that his presence alone would not guarantee safety. The story of this night, the clash of intention and survival, had only just begun. And as the wind whispered through the tall grasses and the men shifted nervously under the fading moonlight, she realized that whatever came next, it would demand courage, wit, and an understanding of the forces at play that she had yet to grasp. The clearing waited, the river waited, the night waited, and the woman waited alongside them, caught between fear and the faint glimmer of protection. Poised on the edge of a story that was only beginning to unfold, the night pressed in closer. Thick and quiet, broken only by the gentle rush of the river and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The three men stood across from the warrior and the woman, their faces tight with unease. Fear had begun to gnaw at their confidence, though none of them admitted it aloud. The tallest man clenched his fists at his sides, his mind racing for a way out of the impossible situation. The wiry one fidgeted, shifting weight from foot to foot, eyes darting toward the forest as if plotting a sudden escape. The scarred man stayed still, though his knuckles were white as he gripped the hilt of a knife tucked into his belt. The woman's attention kept returning to the warrior. He had not moved aggressively, but his presence alone demanded respect. Every breath he drew seemed measured, every glance calculated. She noticed the way his eyes lingered on the men, reading them like pages in a story. She wondered what he had seen before this moment. What battles had honed his instincts so finely? There was a history there, something unspoken yet unmistakable. And she felt the faintest trace of reassurance knowing he had chosen to intervene. Yet the danger remained. Hanging in the air like smoke from a distant fire, the tallest man finally spoke, his voice low and cautious. "We don't want trouble," he said, though the edge of desperation betrayed him. "We can walk away from this." The words hung in the night, offering both a truce and a challenge. The warrior's gaze didn't waver, silence carrying a weight that made the man's bravado falter. The wiry man scoffed nervously, shaking his head. "We came for something, and we're not leaving empty-handed," he said, voice quivering slightly. His eyes flicked to the woman, and she felt a chill run down her spine. She had a sinking sense that their intentions were more than just territorial or petty. They were hunting something, and somehow she was at the center. The scarred man stepped closer, his movements deliberate, eyes locked on the warrior. "Step aside, or it'll get ugly," he growled. Even he couldn't hide the tremor in his voice. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying a warning, and the river's surface glimmered faintly in the moonlight. The woman clutched her satchel tighter, instinct screaming that whatever they sought was tied to what she carried. The warrior shifted slightly, knocking an arrow, but keeping it trained toward the ground. His stance was calm, yet every muscle in his body was taut ready. He did not speak, but his presence was a message as clear as any words. There would be consequences if they acted recklessly. The woman felt her heart thundering, caught between fear and awe, uncertain if she should speak or simply wait. A thought struck her suddenly. Who were these men really? Their intentions seemed tangled, a mixture of greed, desperation, and perhaps revenge. And why had they chosen this riverbank? A place so isolated for whatever they had planned? The frontier had always been harsh, full of hidden dangers and secrets, but this felt different. It was personal, calculated, and relentless. The warrior's eyes flicked toward the river briefly, and back to the men, and she sensed the silent questions forming between him and them. He was asking for patience, for hesitation, for the space to understand their moves before they acted. It was a strategy honed by years of surviving where every decision mattered. The woman realized that his presence was more than protection. It was guidance, a living warning that every choice carried weight. Suddenly, a movement in the shadows drew her gaze. A fox, quick and cautious, darted across the underbrush, pausing briefly before disappearing. It was insignificant in itself, yet its sudden appearance seemed to mirror the tension that gripped them all. Every rustle, every shift of wind, carried the potential for escalation. She shivered, knowing the night could erupt at any second. The wiry man muttered something to the scarred one. A hurried exchange that made the tallest man's face tighten with irritation. Whatever plan they had, it was fragile now, disrupted by the unexpected arrival of the warrior. The woman sensed their frustration mounting, a dangerous mix that could spark violence. She had survived the frontier in small ways before, but this felt like a test she had not prepared for. The warrior stepped lightly toward them, just enough to narrow the space without appearing threatening. His eyes remained sharp, noting each micro-movement, each flicker of intention. She wondered what he saw in them, what he predicted. Was it experience, instinct, or something deeper? A connection to the land and its unspoken rules. She felt both relief and uncertainty. He was skilled. Yes, but the men's desperation was tangible. And desperation could make even the cautious reckless. The tallest man spoke again, voice louder this time, trying to regain control. "You don't understand what we're after?" Step aside and nobody gets hurt." His eyes flicked to the woman, and she caught a hint of recognition that he believed she knew more than she let on. She had no idea what he thought she carried, but the thought that she might be part of some larger puzzle tightened. The knot of fear in her stomach. The scarred man's jaw tightened. "Enough talk," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He flexed his fingers around the knife, and the wiry man tensed beside him, ready to follow. The woman could see it in their stance. A moment away from action, their plan fraying under the weight of uncertainty. She felt trapped, yet strangely aware that the warrior's calm presence was the only barrier. Between survival and disaster, a distant howl carried through the trees. Faint yet sharp, reminding her of the wilderness that surrounded them. She realized the frontier itself was watching, every shadow and sound a participant in the unfolding drama. She thought of the letters and papers she carried, the quiet life she had left behind, and wondered how they had become entwined in this conflict. The answers eluded her. Deepening the mystery that now surrounded the river bend, the warrior shifted again. Out! Raising his bow slowly, though never threateningly. The men flinched, each aware that one wrong move could spark chaos. The woman's pulse quickened. She sensed that the river, the trees, even the night sky, were now witnesses to an invisible standoff, a silent game where misstep could mean injury or worse. The tension was palpable, pressing against her chest, curling around her thoughts like the curling mist over the river's surface. She tried to recall every story she had heard as a child, the ones where settlers faced bandits, where warriors defended the helpless, where courage and quick thinking made the difference. Each story had ended in triumph or tragedy, yet none had prepared her for this living tableau. She had read of Apache warriors who could appear from nowhere, who could turn the tide with skill and instinct, but seeing one in person, watching him hold the space between life and danger, was something else entirely. The scarred man muttered under his breath, and the wiry one shook his head. Whatever plans they had, it was clear now they had underestimated the situation. She could see the cracks in their confidence, the flickers of doubt that the warrior's presence had ignited, and yet she knew this night was far from over. They would not yield easily, not when desire, greed, some unknown motive drove them forward. The warrior's eyes met hers briefly, and she felt a subtle reassurance. He was not merely defending, he was analyzing, predicting, waiting. There was patience in him, but it was not limitless. Every second passed like a drumbeat in the dark, echoing the tension that gripped the clearing. She realized that the story unfolding here was larger than any single person, larger than the fear or the danger. It was a collision of motives, instincts, and the raw unpredictability of the frontier. The river whispered along its bank, carrying the night's chill and the quiet promise of secrets hidden in its depths. The woman's fingers tightened on her satchel once more, and she felt the weight of the unknown pressing around her. She wanted answers, to understand why she had been caught in this peril, what the men sought, and what had drawn the warrior here. Yet the night offered none, only shadows and uncertainty. The wind shifted again, rustling the trees and carrying with it the faint scent of smoke, perhaps from distant campfires or some unseen threat. The tallest man's eyes narrowed, the wiry man's hands trembled slightly, and the scarred man's jaw clenched. Each of them was caught in a moment where action and hesitation balanced on a knife's edge. The woman felt the fragile thread of suspense tighten, knowing the night could erupt at any moment. And all the while, as the warrior remained steady, silent, a sentinel carved from the land itself. He had not moved aggressively, yet every motion he made communicated readiness. An unspoken message that danger would not pass without reckoning. The woman understood finally that this confrontation was far from simple. It was not just about survival or protection, it was about choices, timing, and the forces that had brought them all to this place at this exact moment. The clearing waited, the river waited, and the night waited. The tension remained unresolved, stretching between predator and protector, between fear and courage, between what was known and what was hidden in the shadows. And as the moon rose higher, casting a pale light over the scene, The woman realized that whatever came next, it would demand more than courage. It would demand understanding, instinct, and an unshakable awareness of the forces at play in the wild. Untamed frontier, the night pressed in thicker now, darkness pooling over the riverbend like ink, leaving only the faint silver gleam of moonlight to sketch the edges of trees and water. Every sound felt amplified, each rustle of leaves or snapping of a twig carrying weight beyond the ordinary. The woman's pulse hammered in her ears as she glanced between the three men and the warrior. They had been circling each other like predators and prey, but now the air itself seemed to hum with expectation. The night was alive, aware, and waiting for the first spark to ignite what felt inevitable. The tallest man shifted, the muscles in his jaw tightening as he stared at the warrior. His hands twitched, betraying his frustration, though he tried to mask it. He wanted to be in control, to assert dominance. Yet the calm certainty of the warrior made him doubt every instinct. The wiry man muttered something low and quick, a warning, a plan, or maybe a plea she could not tell. The scarred man's eyes darted between the woman and the warrior, a cold calculation in his gaze. She felt the weight of their scrutiny, the unspoken questions in the dark. What did she carry that mattered so much? What role had fate assigned her in this quiet, tense battlefield? The warrior remained poised, a living anchor against the swelling threat. His bow was still in hand, nocked but lowered just enough to show restraint. The woman noticed the faint scratches on his forearms, marks that told of battles survived, perhaps not all won. There was a story etched into him, a history of surviving the wilderness, of reading danger before it could strike. She realized he had not appeared by chance. Something had guided him here, something older than the river or the trees. The wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and distant smoke. The river whispered against the bank, a quiet murmur that contrasted the tension at its edge. The woman shifted slightly, clutching her satchel closer. She tried to steady her racing thoughts, but the forest seemed to conspire with the men, hiding their movements, echoing every shift in the shadows. Each heartbeat stretched, each breath seemed loud, as though the night itself were holding its breath with her. The tallest man spoke again, voice strained but louder this time, forcing its way through the tension. "We're not fools," he said. "We know what we want, and we won't leave without it." The words were a warning, a promise, and a threat all at once. The woman sensed the danger behind them was more than physical. It was desire twisted into obsession, a drive that could make men reckless and violent. The scarred man stepped forward slightly, knife glinting in the moonlight, but his hesitation was evident. He had planned aggression, yet instinct made him pause. He had never faced an opponent who commanded the air around him without raising a hand. The warrior's presence was a challenge, a barrier to be reckoned with, and even the cruelest of men could not ignore it. The woman's eyes darted to the river, to the forest, seeking any avenue of escape. None existed without crossing the men's path. Every moment she considered a choice. The warrior's calm, steady form reminded her that timing was as important as courage. She felt a strange connection, a silent understanding between them. He had arrived just in time, yet she knew his patience had limits. One wrong move could ignite the fragile standoff into chaos. The wiry man muttered under his breath, words lost in the night, but she felt the desperation behind them. Each of the three men was caught in a storm of greed, fear, and frustration, their plans unraveling under the weight of the unknown. She realized that the conflict was more than just survival. It was a collision of motives, histories, and obsessions. Every shadow could conceal an ally or a threat. Every movement could change the balance. The warrior shifted, moving slightly forward, narrowing the space between him and the men without aggression. The tension spiked, the men's reaction sharp and immediate, as if he had drawn some invisible line they could not cross. The woman's breath caught. The night had become a crucible, the clearing a stage where every small decision carried outsized consequences. She could feel her pulse in her throat, the rhythm echoing the river's slow, relentless flow. A distant howl cut through the darkness, a wild sound that seemed to vibrate with the tension at the riverbank. The woman shivered. The frontier was alive tonight. every element conspiring with the moment, every sound a harbinger of what could come. She glanced at the warrior, whose eyes remained sharp, scanning the men and the terrain with uncanny precision. He was not just waiting, he was predicting, reading, anticipating. The tallest man's hand twitched near the rifle strapped to his back. It's a subtle motion, but enough to make the wiry one tense. The scarred man's grip on his knife tightened. Each of them was balancing on a knife's edge, unsure whether the next movement would be survival or disaster. The woman felt the tension coil around her, tightening like a noose, and she realized the night could erupt at any moment. The river glimmered faintly in the moonlight, but it no longer felt like a refuge. It had become a silent observer, carrying the undercurrents of fear and strategy downstream. The woman felt a strange sense of being caught between two worlds, the calm, steady strength of the warrior and the unpredictable, volatile menace of the men across from them. She clutched her satchel tighter, aware that it held something the men wanted, though she did not yet know why. The wind shifted again, and a branch snapped somewhere in the forest, drawing every eye to the sound. The warrior's head moved slight and precise, as if acknowledging a new variable in the standoff. The men flinched, uncertainty creeping into their movements. The woman realized that this night was as much about perception as it was about force, that every gesture, every glance, carried significance. The scarred man muttered a curse and shifted forward again, knife glinting faintly. The wiry man's hands shook, betraying the tension that had been building since the moment they had cornered her. Even the tallest man, whose confidence had seemed unshakable, now hesitated, aware that any misstep could tip the delicate balance. The woman felt her chest tighten. She understood, in a way she had not before, how fragile this moment was. The line between safety and danger had narrowed to a breath. The warrior's eyes flicked to her, and she felt a silent message pass between them. Wait. Observe. Trust the instinct that had brought him here. His calm radiance contrasted with the frantic energy of the men, drawing a line of tension that neither side could ignore. The woman understood that the outcome would hinge not just on force, but on choices made in this suspended, electric moment. A rustle in the underbrush made the wiry man flinch, and the scarred man swore under his breath. The tallest man's hand hovered near the rifle, indecision etched across his face. The woman's fingers tightened on her satchel, each heartbeat echoing the suspense that hung in the clearing. She realized that every sound, every shadow, every movement could trigger a chain reaction that none of them could. Control the river's current whispered along the bank, slow and deliberate, carrying the night's secrets downstream. The woman felt the weight of history pressing on her shoulders. The frontier was not just land, it was legacy, law, and the raw unpredictability of human nature. The warrior embodied that legacy, his presence a bridge between survival and danger. The men represented chaos, their motives hidden, yet clear enough to be threatening. The wind rose suddenly, tossing leaves across the clearing, carrying a faint scent of smoke. Perhaps a distant fire or the approaching storm? The warrior shifted subtly, 1 foot forward, body coiled like a spring. The men tensed, and the woman's stomach twisted. The night had reached a point where tension could explode with the slightest provocation. Every second dragged, heavy with anticipation, each movement pregnant with potential disaster. The woman's eyes flicked between the river, the forest, and the warrior. She could feel her pulse in every nerve ending, the anticipation building until it was almost unbearable. She realized the climax of this night was approaching, the culmination of every choice, every instinct, every hidden motive, and yet nothing had been resolved. The danger was still real, still pressing, and the balance of power had yet to be tested. The clearing waited, the river waited, and the forest waited. The men shifted, each uncertain, calculating, ready to act but wary of the consequences. The warrior remained steadfast, a living shield and strategist rolled into one. Watching, predicting, waiting for the exact moment that would demand action. The woman, caught between fear and hope, understood that the night would soon demand more than courage. It would demand split-second decisions, trust in instinct, and the awareness that the smallest movement could change everything. The stars above were faint now, nearly swallowed by clouds, and the shadows seemed to grow longer, darker, more threatening. The river murmured softly, carrying the suspense downstream, and the woman felt the weight of every unspoken thought, every hidden intention pressing down. The night was poised on the edge of action, every breath held in collective anticipation, and as silence fell, deeper and heavier than before, the clearing seemed to hold its breath with her. With the warrior, with the men, the river, the forest, and the night itself had become part of the standoff. Witnesses to a moment where conflict, fear, and courage converged. She felt the tension coil like a living thing, knowing that whatever came next would change everything, yet the outcome remained hidden, suspended in the dark like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The tension broke with a sound that seemed almost too small to matura, twigs snapping underfoot. Yet in the charged stillness of the night, it became the spark that ignited everything. The scarred man lunged, knife raised, and the wiry man followed his lead, reckless in their desperation. The tallest man hesitated for a heartbeat too long, his indecision costing him the advantage he thought he held. The warrior moved like the wind itself, swift and precise, not just reacting, but anticipating. Drawing the chaos into a controlled rhythm only he seemed to understand, an arrow whistled through the air. Embedding itself in the dirt near the tallest man's feet, the sudden movement made all three men freeze, a sharp jolt of fear cutting through their bravado. The woman stumbled back, her hands clutching her satchel, heart hammering. But she remained behind the warrior's steady form. She could feel his calm radiating outward, the same unshakable presence that had kept her alive up to this moment. Each action he took was deliberate, minimal, but devastatingly effective. The wiry man tried to circle, seeking a flank, but the warrior was already there, his movements a step ahead. He didn't strike without reason. Instead, he used presence and positioning, forcing the men into decisions they didn't want to make. Each choice they took brought them closer to defeat, closer to understanding that brute force alone could not overcome the quiet mastery of someone who lived by instinct and skill honed over years. The woman's mind raced as she watched the standoff unfold. The men were more than aggressors. They were fragments of lives twisted by greed, fear, and past grudges. She thought of the tallest man, who had once commanded respect but now floundered, paralyzed by his inability to act decisively. The wiry one, so quick and calculating in his movements, had underestimated the power of observation and patience. And the scarred man, whose presence had once been the most intimidating, was finally confronting the consequences of relying on raw strength alone. The warrior didn't speak, yet his actions told the story. Every movement was a lesson in precision and control, a demonstration that survival depended on awareness, courage, and timing. The woman realized that this was not just a fight. It was a lesson in the truth of the frontier, a reminder that the wilderness demanded respect and that every choice carried weight. She felt gratitude and awe, understanding that this man's skill was as much about wisdom as it was about strength. The river shimmered faintly beside them, witness to the unfolding drama. Its currents whispered secrets, carrying with them the echoes of danger and survival. The woman thought about the satchel she carried, the small but meaningful connection to a life she had tried to preserve. Somehow, the contents of her satchel had drawn the men here, had entangled her in their schemes. She didn't need to know all the details to understand one thing. The warrior's intervention had given her a chance to survive, a chance to see beyond the immediate peril. The scarred man made a sudden, desperate move, lunging toward the river. The warrior met him instantly, blocking the path with a skillful sweep that forced the man off balance. The wiry man hesitated, and in that hesitation, the arrow he had ignored earlier found its mark in the ground near his boot. The sound a stark reminder of how carefully the warrior measured each risk. The tallest man's face twisted with frustration, but there was nowhere to go, no leverage to seize. The night had shifted. The balance of power had tilted irrevocably. The woman realized that the confrontation was ending not with brute force, but with the understanding that survival required awareness, strategy, and respect for forces beyond immediate comprehension. The warrior didn't celebrate his advantage, didn't taunt the men. He simply held his ground. A living testament to the principle that skill and calm could turn the tide of even the most desperate situations. The scarred man finally stopped, chest heaving, knife lowered, but still in hand. The wiry man staggered back, eyes wide, realizing the futility of his movements. The tallest man's face fell into resignation. The threat that had seemed imminent now waned, dissipated by the quiet authority of someone who knew the land and himself far better than they knew either. The woman exhaled slowly, tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding releasing in a trembling wave. The warrior turned to her briefly, eyes softening, and for the first time she saw a flicker of human warmth behind the vigilance. He did not need to speak. She understood that she was safe, at least for now, that the danger had been contained. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing the satchel, her gratitude palpable. The night was still, the river flowing calmly beside them, and the forest seemed to breathe with a sense of quiet relief. The men, now subdued, began retreating into the darkness, their plans and motives thwarted. The scarred man muttered a curse, the wiry man followed reluctantly, and the tallest man hung back just long enough to catch a final glance at the warrior. They disappeared into the shadows, leaving the clearing and riverbank to reclaim their stillness. The woman watched them go, a mixture of relief and lingering fear settling in her chest. She realized that the frontier was not forgiving, and even the smallest misstep could have led to a very different outcome. The warrior finally lowered his bow, and the woman noticed the subtle stiffness in his shoulders, a quiet testament to the tension that had been sustained through the night. He had not fought recklessly. He had guided, anticipated, and protected. She felt a deep sense of respect, not just for his skill, but for the restraint and judgment that had kept them both alive. The river's surface reflected the first hints of dawn, soft light creeping through the horizon, painting the trees in gold and lavender. The woman felt a shift in herself, a renewed awareness of the fragility and preciousness of life on the frontier. She had come seeking solitude, yet she had found danger, courage, and an unlikely protector. The experience left her changed, more aware of the delicate threads that connected choice, survival, and morality in a world that often demanded tough decisions. The warrior knelt briefly by the river, dipping his hand into the cool water. The gesture seemed almost ceremonial, a quiet acknowledgement of the land, the river, and the life it sustained. The woman watched, understanding that he carried burdens and histories she could only glimpse. He was a bridge between survival and morality, between past lessons and present action. She realized that the frontier had shaped him as it had shaped countless others, into someone who could command respect and instill hope simultaneously. The woman took a step forward, her satchel secure, and spoke for the first time in what felt like hours. "Thank you," she said softly. The words were simple, yet heavy with meaning. The warrior nodded slightly, eyes meeting hers with a silent affirmation. No further words were needed. The night had spoken in deeds, in movements. In the quiet assertion of presence and skill, she turned toward the river, watching the water flow, and thought about the men who had threatened her. She understood that their lives were guided by desperation and choice, by decisions made in darkness and unchecked ambition. Yet she felt no malice toward them, only an understanding of how the frontier shaped people, how circumstance could twist motives, and how courage and vigilance could tip the balance between survival and disaster. The warrior stood, glancing once more toward the forest, then back to her. His gaze carried a quiet question, an acknowledgement that while this night had ended, the world remained full of challenges and uncertainties. She nodded slightly, understanding that the frontier was never truly at rest, that vigilance and courage were constants in a life lived close to the edge of danger. Together, they walked along the riverbank, the first light of morning illuminating the path. Each step felt deliberate, a connection to the land and to the choices that had brought them here. She realized that survival was not simply a matter of strength or skill, but of timing, understanding, and the willingness to trust those who walked with you through peril, the clearing slowly returned to stillness. The river's gentle murmur carrying away the echoes of confrontation. The forest seemed to exhale, shadows receding in the soft glow of dawn. The woman felt a sense of closure without finality. Life on the frontier continued, unpredictable and demanding, yet also filled with moments of grace and protection. She carried with her not only the satchel and its contents, but the lesson that courage, patience, and trust could turn the tide of even the darkest night. As they reached a bend in the river, the warrior paused, glancing back at the path they had come from. She understood without words that this was more than a journey to safety. It was a step into a world where every decision mattered, where choices resonated far beyond the moment, and where human connection could be as powerful as any weapon. The men were gone, the danger dissipated. Yet the lessons remained, etched into the land, the river, and the woman herself. The sun rose higher, casting warm light over the clearing, painting the river in streaks of gold. She felt a sense of quiet triumph, not over the men or the danger, but over fear itself. The warrior's presence, his skill, his calm, had shown her that survival on the frontier was as much about courage and understanding as it was about strength. She had learned the power of awareness, of patience, and of trusting in the forces that moved unseen but ever present in the wilderness. The river continued its endless flow, carrying away remnants of the night, whispering the stories of courage, tension, and survival. The woman took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the satchel, the memory of the men, and the presence of the warrior beside her. She realized that this night, this confrontation had changed her, shaped her understanding of danger, trust, and the frontier itself. And as the first full light of day touched the river bend, she stepped forward with resolve, carrying with her the lessons of the night, the strength to face the unknown, the wisdom to recognize true courage, and the knowledge that even in the darkest moments, guidance, skill, and the quiet presence of someone who cares could make all the difference. The story of that night would remain, etched into memory and land alike, a testament to survival, vigilance, and the human spirit.